and bond a group of frightened young men that a well-timed jab, rather than causing offense, could actually pull people closer together. That lesson stuck with him for the rest of his life. Back in New York after the war, with acting work scarce, he turned to nightclubs. His early act mixed dramatic monologue with the occasional joke, and it mostly fell flat, until one night a heckler pushed him, and Rickles fired back with an unscripted insult that brought the house down. That was the moment the direction of his whole career changed. Audiences didn't want a rehearsed performer. They wanted someone dangerous and unfiltered. By the early 1950s, Rickles had fully committed to insult comedy, a style barely established at the time. There was no real setup and punchline structure. He'd simply walk out, scan the room, and start firing at whoever was in front of him. Haircuts, outfits, whatever was closest at hand. Remarkably, none of it landed as cruelty. Audiences left feeling singled out in a good way, flattered even, and that strange balance, brutal material delivered with real affection, became his signature. It's around this period that he earned a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Mr. Warmth, a tongue-in-cheek title for a man whose stage persona was anything but gentle. Audiences understood, though, that underneath the abuse was a kind of invitation. He insulted the people he liked, and the harsher the joke, the more it usually meant. Nightclub success was one thing. Hollywood was another mountain entirely, and it took a chance encounter with Frank Sinatra to get Rickles there. Sinatra wasn't just famous. In that era, he was close to untouchable, someone almost no comic would dare mock to his face. When Sinatra caught one of Rickles' shows in Miami, Rickles looked straight at him and cracked a line, suggesting Sinatra make himself useful and rough somebody up. The room reportedly froze for a beat, and then Sinatra laughed harder than anyone. That single exchange changed everything. Sinatra took a liking to Rickles' nerve, and from then on became his most powerful advocate, pulling him into rooms, introducing him around, and defending his abrasive style to anyone who complained. Sinatra's endorsement effectively became Rickles' ticket into the industry's inner circle. From there, national television opened up, especially through recurring appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, who loved the unpredictability Rickles brought. Mocking the host, teasing the band, riffing on the studio audience, all live and unscripted. It made for can't-miss television, and it turned Rickles from a club act into a household name. The Dean Martin celebrity roast pushed his profile further still, putting him in the same room as Ronald Reagan, Bob Hope, and Sinatra himself, all of whom he took apart on camera to great laughter. Being roasted by Rickles became something close to a status symbol in Hollywood, proof you belonged. He also kept chasing the acting career he'd originally wanted. With Sinatra's backing, he landed dramatic film roles, including a part alongside Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster in Run Silent, Run Deep 1958, and later a comedic turn opposite Clint Eastwood in Kelly's Heroes 1970. By the mid-1970s, he even had his own sitcom, CPO Sharky, playing a gruff Navy officer that suited his delivery perfectly. For all his stage ferocity, Rickles' private life told a different story. He met Barbara Sklar relatively late for a man of his generation, and by most accounts, part of what drew him to her was that she wasn't impressed by his jokes or his fame. They married in 1965, and unlike the chaos of his career, the marriage was steady from the start. Friends often describe Barbara as the anchor that kept him grounded. Together they raised 2 children, Mindy and Larry, both of whom went into entertainment. At home, the man audiences knew as the Merchant of Venom was reportedly warm, sentimental, and deeply protective of his family. That softer side was tested by tragedy in 2011, when the couple's son Larry died of pneumonia at just 41, a loss that reportedly never fully left either parent, even as Rickles continued performing. His grandchildren, meanwhile, knew him less as a legendary insult comic and more as Grandpa Don, or, just as often, as the voice behind Mr. Potato Head in Pixar's Toy Story films. He liked to joke that after decades in the business, his lasting legacy might just be a talking plastic potato. But by most accounts, he was genuinely proud that his humor had reached an entirely new generation. Barbara stayed by his side for the rest of his life, and their marriage lasted more than 50 years. A rarity in an industry not known for staying power. Rickles kept performing. Don Rickles spent a career turning insults into applause. Presidents, movie stars, and total strangers in the third row all took their turn under his tongue, and somehow, almost everyone walked away grinning. But there was a single figure who never gave in the reaction he lived for. No smile, no wince, no wink back. That quiet resistance apparently bothered Rickles more than any heckler ever could. Rickles made his name by sparing no one. Politicians, Hollywood royalty. Even the friends closest to him became material the second he stepped up to a microphone. Yet instead of resentment, his targets usually responded with affection. Frank Sinatra, a man most people were terrified to cross, ended up embracing Rickles rather than blacklisting him. That was the trick. He could cut you down and still leave you laughing. One man, though, never gave him that payoff. Denzel Washington. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand how Rickles' comedy actually worked. It wasn't built around clever writing so much as live reaction. The nervous laugh, the raised eyebrow, the good sport who let himself be the punchline for a moment. The joke itself was only half of it. The other half was the target's visible willingness to play along. Without that, an insult just sat there unclaimed. Washington reportedly never gave him that. No smirk, no chuckle, nothing but that famously composed, serious expression. On camera, Washington carries an unmistakable gravity. Off camera, by most accounts, he's much the same, measured, private, and difficult to rattle. For a comedian who needed the room to meet him halfway, that stillness apparently felt like performing for a statue. Where Sinatra played along and Carson practically fell out his chair, Washington offered silence. And to a performer like Rickles, silence functioned almost like an insult of its own. According to those close to him, Rickles tried more than once to crack that composure, tossing out lines in green rooms and at industry events. One reported jab went something like, telling Washington to loosen up because he was making Mount Rushmore look animated by comparison. Whatever the exact wording, the response was reportedly always the same. Nothing. And for a man whose entire identity ran on getting a rise out of people, that nothing apparently stung. Over time, what began as a professional irritation is said to have calcified into something more personal. Friends notice a shift. The casual needling Rickles aimed at people like Sinatra, Eastwood, or Reagan had a playful edge. Whatever he said about Washington, reportedly didn't. It carried something closer to real frustration, maybe even genuine dislike, from a man whose whole brand was supposedly never taking anything too seriously. The irony is that Washington, by all accounts, wasn't trying to provoke anyone. He was simply being himself, reserved, respectful, private. But to Rickles, that reserve apparently read as rejection, not of the material, but of him personally. And that cut deeper than any joke he'd ever thrown at someone else. Because for Rickles, comedy wasn't really about jokes. It was a way of closing distance, of turning strangers and egos into something warmer. When that approach didn't land, it seems to have felt like being shut out. By the end, Rickles could point to plenty of legendary wins. Sinatra's friendship, presidential roasts, decades of Carson doubled over with laughter. The one thing he apparently couldn't claim was ever getting a real reaction out of Denzel Washington. For a man who measured his life in laughs earned, that gap reportedly stayed with him. Long before any of that, Rickles was simply a sharp-tongued kid from Queens. Born Donald J. Rickles on May 8, 1926 in Jackson Heights, New York, he grew up in a modest Jewish household. His father, Max, worked in insurance, and his mother, Etta, raised him with encouragement to think bigger than their small apartment. That encouragement mattered. Etta reportedly recognized early that her son's wit wasn't just mischief, but a kind of armor. As a kid, Rickles was restless and quick, the sort of student whose wisecracks got him both into trouble and into everyone's good graces. He wasn't naturally drawn to comedy, though. His early ambition was legitimate acting. He trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, hoping for Broadway or serious dramatic film work. But during early-stage performances, he began filling dead air with unplanned jokes, and audiences responded louder to those throwaway lines than to the scripted material. Slowly, without quite intending to, he found himself steered toward comedy. World War II put everything on hold. Rickles served in the Navy aboard the USS Irene in the Pacific, and the experience shaped him in ways beyond the obvious. Amid real danger, he discovered that humor could defuse tension.